Not-for-profit marketing, part 3. Here are the outcomes for this section. We're going to understand the differences in strategic orientations among for-profit and not-for-profit organizations, and we're going to focus on the cause orientation, the funding orientation, and the need orientation strategic stages of NFPs. Before we do that, let's just recap on part 2. We learnt about the 5 core characteristics of NFPs: multiple stakeholders, multiple objectives, transparency, service orientation, and customer perceptions. We demonstrated that all these characteristics are underpinned by a service-based approach. We saw that these characteristics apply to all types of NFPs, whether they are in the public sector, the private sector, or social enterprises. And we looked into how all NFPs must hold transparency and accountability as a primary principle. Let's just focus in on the economic context that NFPs are operating within. The paper that we're looking at in this section by Lindsay and Murphy, 1996, they say the economic context within which charities operate bears no resemblance to that in which a private sector organisation operates. So that is setting the economic context for the items we're going to discuss in part 3. And here is a view of that broad landscape. So we take the NSPCC, the children's charity in the United Kingdom. We take that as an example here. We've got a flow of support in the golden arrows. So we've got funders, donors, or benefactors on the left-hand side, giving money to the charity, and they are then redistributing and allocating those resources towards their service or the objectives that they're working towards. In this case, that's towards abused children or neglected children. In the blue boxes, you see the context. So in the dynamic between the charity and the benefactors, you have a resource attraction orientation, and that is to do with selling. So they are selling the cause or selling the mission of the charity in order to raise funds. And the blue box on the right-hand side is the market orientation or the allocation of resources side, and that is where the charity is deciding how to spend the money it has raised in the best way to achieve its mission. Before we go on to look at the strategic orientation stages of a not-for-profit, let's just pause to reflect on the strategic orientation stages of a for-profit, just to set some economic context. So you can see here we have a 3-stage process broadly of product orientation, production orientation, and then selling orientation in the for-profit world. So in the for-profit sector, funds are raised through satisfying customer needs or wants, and that's it. So this is known as market responsiveness. How responsive is your approach to the needs or wants you recognize your customers as having? This idea is covered in the services marketing topic, where we discuss the ability for service firms to decode customer needs and then respond to them. So in the for-profit sector, the person who is benefiting from the offering of the organization is the same person who is also paying for it. As companies grow and learn more about their target customers, they move through these 3 stages of strategic orientation. So when customer knowledge is low and they are at the early stages of growth, they'll be more focused on the development of their product, the product orientation or product-oriented stage. As they gain traction in the market and they grow, they will turn their attention to managing and maximizing the performance of their production processes, so as to serve the customer base they have established with better efficiency, reliability, and profitability. This is the production-oriented stage. And then finally, they'll invest in increasing their effectiveness in selling their products and graduate to the selling-oriented stage. So they're trying to increase their effectiveness in selling the products on the basis of the product development and production maximization they've already gone through. So in the for-profit world, the fundraising, you could say, is taking place through satisfying customers, and that's it. What we see in the not-for-profit world is that separation between the person who needs satisfied, so to speak, and the person providing the financial exchange in order for that satisfaction to take place can be vast. It's between different people, which is fundamentally contrary to the dynamic that we see in the for-profit world. So in effect, not-for-profit marketers have to fight a war on two fronts, on the front of the benefactor and on the front of the beneficiary. They have to establish the services and provision that are necessary to support their identified beneficiaries' needs, and they also have to develop a strategy for raising funds from a different group of stakeholders in order to deliver the money to attend to the recipient's needs. In its infancy, a charity is usually set up to attend to a specific, narrow, easily describable cause, such as, say, to eradicate malaria in Africa, or to eradicate famine, or say to support women who have been victims of sexual violence. At this stage, the organisation is focused on its driving cause and is trying to attract funding from any form of income it can. There is a simple objective and not a great deal of sophistication in relation to the approach to getting funding. So this is called the cause orientation stage. And the cause orientation stage is the starting point for all charities, certainly, and most not-for-profit organisations. We can take this as the foundational strategic orientation of an NFP. It's formed in response to a particular problem. Its aims are focused, very clear, and usually shared by all of those who are involved in the charity or the organisation. And they're able to develop targeted objectives and strategies, so they'll have a very clear message. Before we move on to talk about the next stage, the funding orientation stage, it's important to note that an organisation may stay at the cause orientation stage for quite a long time. They may even stay there forever, depending on the circumstances of the organisation and its goals. In the case where an NFP meets its original objectives, you have a situation where an organisation that has been successful enough at hitting its targets has developed and probably has at least a handful of people employed by now. It will have developed a network of contributors, whether they're volunteers, donors, or people the organisation has developed a relationship with through its activities, as well as having a growing legacy of serving its beneficiaries. A natural consequence of this is that rather than shutting down all of that organisational capability, value, and membership of important networks, the organisation shifts into continuing to use its operation to attract funding, but begins to broaden or change its objectives since its original objectives have now been met. If we flip back to thinking about this in terms of a for-profit business, at this stage, the business is essentially saying, we've got quite good at getting people's money, let's do some more of it. At this point in the paper by Lindsay and Murphy, they consider the organisation to have moved into the funding orientation stage. This is characterised by the charity thinking of itself as a sort of funding machine, a well-oiled organisation that knows how to attract funding and may now broaden its horizons as to the type of funding it might go for. If there is, for example, government money that doesn't quite fit with the original objectives of the NFP, it might still try to get that money because it has the capability to apply for it. And if it gets the money, then it knows it has the ability to use it to do good based on its track record. So those are some of the things that characterize the funding orientation stage. So this is where an NFP is directed towards the attraction of funds, but it is doing so with a broader remit. So you might see multiple different objectives being focused on by an organisation at the funding orientation stage. Once an organization has reached a level of sophistication whereby it is successfully attracting sustainable funding and is taking a generally more strategic approach to the way it conducts itself, the organization will tend to evolve towards a more complex set of shared values that crystallize around a guiding vision. At this stage, the organization will have a strategic reason for opting to target the funding sources it targets. They'll probably have a complex set of activities that it seeks to deliver to support its beneficiaries as well. So one of the things that distinguishes an NFP organization as effectively enacting a need orientation is when it considers the successful attracting of funding to be a consequence of having delivered on its guiding objectives, rather than seeing the attraction of funding as a form of success in and of itself. It's more used to the regularity with which it is successful at attracting funding and can almost take it for granted, for want of a better expression. So the need orientation stage represents a more stable and sustainable organizational outlook, but it is one that has been earned by successfully progressing through the previous stages. So most NFPs that are operating in multiple countries with a complex set of strategic objectives that move across different areas. In the world of medicine, it may be one, if you take cancer charities, for example, a large cancer charity may be supporting research, it may be supporting treatment, it may be supporting bereaved families, it may be supporting all kinds of trials, it may be building hospices, and these are a different and complex set of activities that it is organised around supporting, and those are the kinds of things you'd be looking for to identify an organisation as being in the need orientation stage. So the need orientation is characterised by a development towards a more complex and wider reaching vision. An NFP will have a clear vision that is expressed through its strategic orientation, a bit like the example I just described. The strategic orientation is dominated by resource allocation strategies towards implementing the guiding vision. And the organisation will also resist temptation to be diverted into areas or services that are not part of that guiding vision. That concludes part 3 of not-for-profit marketing. In summary, we've looked at how NFPs need to satisfy multiple stakeholders, and we've specifically looked at comparing the economic contexts of NFPs with more traditional for-profit organisations. We've learned how the cause orientation is simple and focused on attracting funds to a simple objective. The funding orientation looks at attracting funding beyond the original objectives, and the need orientation stage is sophisticated and driven by a guiding vision. In the next section, we'll be looking at branding and communications in not-for-profit marketing.